It was a quiet autumn evening in the small town of Fairview, Oregon, when Jessica Harris made the fateful call. Her voice, trembling yet strangely calm, alerted the dispatcher to an unspeakable crime at her suburban home. "I've done something terrible," she whispered into the phone. "He had demons. I had to save him." When the police arrived, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for years. Austin Harris, Jessica's 17-year-old son, lay lifeless on his bedroom floor. His body was covered in bruises and stab wounds, the room eerily silent except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan. Jessica, still clutching the bloodied kitchen knife, sat by the doorway. Her eyes were vacant, as if detached from the reality of what she had done. Detective Jim Cook, a seasoned investigator with 25 years on the force, arrived shortly after the first responders. He'd seen his share of brutality, but something about this scene unsettled him. Jessica showed no emotion, no remorse, only an unsettling conviction that she had saved her son from some malevolent force. As the medics took Austin's body away, Cook's attention turned to Jessica, now in handcuffs. "I did what I had to," Jessica repeated as they escorted her to the police cruiser. The demons were inside him. Cook stared at her, his gut telling him this was no ordinary case of murder. There was something deeply wrong with Jessica, something that went beyond her bizarre statements. This was more than just another crime scene. It was the beginning of an investigation that would delve into the mind of a woman unhinged and a family shattered by her descent into madness. The next day, Detective Cook sat at his desk, reviewing the initial reports. Austin Harris had been a bright, well-liked student at Fairview High School. No signs of delinquency, no history of violence. His teachers described him as respectful, if a little quiet. There was nothing in his background to suggest he had ever been troubled, let alone possessed by demons. Cook's partner, Detective Lisa Monroe, knocked on his doorframe holding a thick file. "Got Jessica's psychiatric records," she said, handing the folder over. "Turns out she's had some issues in the past." Cook opened the file to find a history of mental health struggles dating back years. Jessica had been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia when Austin was a young child. There were multiple hospitalizations, a series of medications prescribed, and several recommendations for ongoing therapy, but somewhere along the way she had fallen off the radar. The visits stopped, the prescriptions unfilled. "She's been untreated for almost 5 years," Monroe said, flipping through the pages. Her husband left around the same time. Jessica's husband, Michael Harris, had filed for divorce when Austin was just 12. From what the records showed, Michael had moved out of state, leaving Austin in Jessica's care. Custody hadn't been contested. Neighbors told the police that Austin had taken on the role of caretaker for his mother, often missing school to stay home and look after her during her bad days. No one, however, had imagined it would end like this. As Cook and Monroe pieced together the fractured story, a dark picture began to emerge. Jessica's delusions had apparently worsened over the years, leading her to believe that her son was somehow possessed. The more they learned, the more tragic it became. Detective Cook arrived at the Harris home the following day, a modest 2-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac. Yellow crime scene tape still stretched across the front lawn, fluttering in the cool breeze. The house felt heavy with an unnatural stillness, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had occurred just days earlier. Cook was there to find answers, to try and make sense of the senseless. Inside, the crime scene unit was finishing up their sweep. The living room was cluttered, showing signs of neglect: piles of unwashed dishes, unopened mail, and scattered clothes. Upstairs, Austin's room was a stark contrast. It was neat, almost sterile, as though he had been the only one holding on to some semblance of normalcy. His bed was made, school books stacked neatly on a small desk, but now the walls told a different story. Scrawled in thick black marker were words and symbols, unintelligible phrases about demons, salvation, and cleansing. They covered nearly every surface in his bedroom. Cook's heart sank as he surveyed the markings. It was clear that Jessica's delusions had taken hold long before that final fatal night. This wasn't a sudden act of violence, but the result of years of deteriorating mental health. "She believed she was saving him," Monroe said quietly, stepping beside him. "But why now? What triggered it?" Cook shook his head, eyes still scanning the walls. Something pushed her over the edge. Maybe it was her untreated illness finally reaching a breaking point. Or maybe something small, something we missed: an argument, a bad episode. He sighed. "We need to talk to people who knew them. Teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen what was going on before this." Monroe nodded, making a note in her pad. "I'll start with the neighbors. Maybe someone saw something leading up to the night of the murder." As Monroe left to interview those who lived nearby, Cook lingered in Austin's room. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface. There was more to this story, more pain, more suffering that no one had seen coming. He needed to understand how a mother, even a sick one, could come to believe her own son was possessed. The interview started the next morning. Most of the neighbors were polite but guarded, shaken by the horrific events that had unfolded on their street. Fairview was the kind of town where people kept to themselves, only nodding politely when passing each other. No one had really known the Harris family, and that now seemed to haunt them. One neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, lived directly across the street. She was an elderly woman, soft-spoken and kind, with a deep sadness in her eyes as she described Jessica and Austin. They were quiet, Mrs. Wilkins recalled. I didn't see them much, but I'd see Austin walking to school in the mornings. He always looked so tired, poor boy. Sometimes he'd have to help his mother to the car. She'd forget where she parked it, or she'd be standing in the yard talking to herself. Mrs. Wilkins had never thought much of it, assuming Jessica's odd behavior was just another quirk in their quiet community. But looking back, she realized there had been signs she hadn't connected at the time. She seemed to get worse over the last few months, she added. I'd see her outside at all hours of the night talking about demons and spirits. She said things were coming for her, but I didn't know what she meant. Cook listened carefully, making mental notes. It was clear that Jessica's mental health had been deteriorating rapidly, and it seemed that Austin had been the only one trying to manage it. The weight of that responsibility must have been crushing, especially for a boy of his age. But no one had stepped in, not the neighbors, not the school, not even the local authorities. Before leaving, Cook asked Mrs. Wilkins one final question. Do you know if Jessica ever spoke to anyone else? Did she ever reach out for help? Mrs. Wilkins shook her head, looking pained. No, detective. She kept to herself, and now it's too late. Cook left the interview feeling a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. The system had failed Austin, and now he was dead. Detective Cook returned to the station, haunted by the weight of the case. He sat at his desk, sifting through more interviews, reports, and psychological evaluations. Despite all the information, one thing remained clear: Jessica's untreated mental illness had driven her to believe Austin was possessed. But there were still unanswered questions about what had pushed her over the edge that night. Monroe entered the room, dropping a fresh report on his desk. Just got the autopsy back, she said quietly. Austin's body was in worse condition than we thought. Bruising, older injuries, looks like he had been suffering for a while. Cook's stomach turned as he read the details. In addition to the stab wounds that had killed him, Austin had marks indicating he had been physically restrained. Rope fibers were found embedded in his wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been tied down at some point in the days leading up to his death. That poor kid, Cook muttered. He wasn't just killed, she tortured him. Monroe nodded, her expression grim. It gets worse. Austin's school counselor mentioned something that could explain the timing. Apparently, Austin had recently been accepted to a college out of state. He'd been planning to leave Fairview after graduation, which meant he would have left Jessica alone. The pieces started to come together in Cook's mind. Jessica's already fragile state had likely been shattered by the idea of losing her son, her only source of stability and care. In her delusional mind, Austin's desire to leave must have been interpreted as the ultimate betrayal, or worse, proof that the demons had taken control of him. So she snapped, Cook said. She couldn't bear the thought of him leaving, and in her twisted reality, she believed she had to save him before it was too late. Monroe folded her arms. She probably thought the demons were winning, that Austin was slipping away from her because of them. In her mind, this was her last chance to stop it. Cook stared at the autopsy report, the brutal reality sinking in. Jessica Harris hadn't just killed her son out of malice or hatred. She had done it out of a deluded sense of love, a desperate, tragically misguided attempt to protect him from a fate that only existed in her mind. Get me everything we have on her psychiatric history, Cook said, his voice tight. I want to know exactly when she stopped getting help and why no one did anything about it. As Monroe left to gather the files, Cook leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He had seen many tragedies in his years as a detective, but this one felt different. Austin had been failed at every turn by his mother, by the system, by the people who should have seen the warning signs. This was more than just another case of violence. It was the story of a boy who had tried to save his mother, only to be destroyed by the very person who should have protected him. By the end of the week, Cook and Monroe had pieced together a timeline of Jessica's decline. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when Austin was 7 years old, shortly after her husband had left. At first, she had been committed to a treatment plan, attending therapy and taking prescribed medications regularly. For several years, it seemed as though she had been managing her illness well enough to keep her life and Austin's together. But something had shifted when Austin turned 12. Jessica had suddenly stopped attending her therapy appointments. The notes from her psychiatrist indicated that she had become increasingly distrustful of doctors and medication. Convinced that they were part of the problem, she believed they were trying to poison her, and in her paranoid state, she pulled away from any form of help. The worst part, Cook realized, was that no one had followed up. There had been no welfare checks, no forced interventions. Jessica had been left to spiral, her untreated illness slowly consuming her until it led to the unthinkable. Here's what doesn't sit right with me, Monroe said, reviewing the notes. There were so many red flags. The school knew Austin was missing classes to take care of her. Neighbors noticed she was getting worse. Why didn't anyone do anything? They probably didn't think it was their problem, Cook replied bitterly. People get comfortable looking the other way when it's not directly affecting them. The school likely assumed it was a family matter. The neighbors probably didn't think it was serious until it was too late. Monroe sighed, rubbing her temples. We're looking at a perfect storm, aren't we? A mentally ill woman, a neglected child, and a system that let both of them down. Cook nodded. And now we've got a dead boy and a mother who thinks she's some kind of savior. As the two detectives prepared to question Jessica again, Cook couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, layers of pain and isolation that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Detective Cook and Monroe sat across from Jessica Harris in the small, windowless interrogation room. Jessica, still in her orange jumpsuit, appeared calm, almost serene. Her eyes, though dull, flickered with a strange sense of peace. It was as if, in her mind, she had already justified her actions. To her, this was not a confession but a validation of what she believed she had done for her son. Jessica Cook began, his voice steady but firm. We've gone through everything. We've spoken to your neighbors, reviewed your psychiatric history, and we know about Austin's plans for college. At the mention of Austin's name, Jessica's lips tightened, and her hands fidgeted in her lap. She avoided eye contact, her gaze drifting to the table. You believed Austin was possessed, Monroe continued gently, that the demons were taking over. But we know that you stopped taking your medication years ago. You stopped seeing your doctors. Why did you stop getting help, Jessica? Jessica's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table as she muttered. They didn't understand. They were part of it. The doctors, the pills, it was all part of their plan. I had to protect us. I had to protect him. Protect him from what? Cook asked, leaning forward slightly. Austin wasn't possessed, Jessica. He was your son. He loved you. He wasn't the enemy. Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide and angry. You don't understand. You didn't see what I saw. It started with his eyes, how they changed. He wasn't my Austin anymore. The demons were inside him, controlling him. I couldn't let them take him away. I had to save him. Cook exchanged a glance with Monroe. Her delusions were so deep that there was no reaching her, not in the way they had hoped. But there was something else, something they needed to hear directly from her. Jessica, Monroe asked softly, why did you tie Austin up? What were you trying to do to him in those last few days? Jessica's face fell into her hands, trembling. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. I tried everything. I prayed, I read from the Bible. I thought if I kept him still, the demons wouldn't be able to hurt him. But he kept fighting me. He kept telling me he wasn't possessed, but I knew better. I could see it in his eyes. The demons lie, detective. They trick you. Her voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. He begged me to let him go. He said he was leaving, going to college, but that wasn't him talking. That was the demon inside him trying to get away. I had to stop it. I had to. Cook felt the weight of her words like a heavy stone in his chest. The tragedy wasn't just that she had killed Austin. The true horror was that, in her fractured mind, she had believed she was saving him. Jessica had tortured her son for days, driven by a psychosis that convinced her she was fighting for his soul, and no one had been there to stop her. Monroe, her voice barely above a whisper, asked, what happened the night Austin died? Jessica wiped her tears, her eyes distant and hollow. I was running out of time. The demon was getting stronger, I thought. If I freed his body, maybe I could save his soul. Her voice wavered, but her conviction remained chillingly clear. So, I had to set him free. Silence filled the room. Cook felt a surge of anger and sorrow, but he knew that Jessica was beyond understanding the full gravity of what she had done. In her delusional world, she had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect her son, but all she had really done was destroy the only person who had tried to care for her. Thank you, Jessica, Cook said, standing to leave. He couldn't stay in the room any longer. The weight of her words, her belief in the righteousness of her actions, was suffocating. As he and Monroe stepped out into the hallway, Cook shook his head in frustration. She doesn't even realize she's guilty. She thinks she's some kind of hero. Monroe sighed, her face pale. She's too far gone, Jim. This isn't someone we can reason with. She's been lost to her illness for a long time. They walked back to their desks in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Despite all their efforts, there was no saving Jessica Harris from the consequences of what she had done. But for Cook, the real question was this: how many other families were being torn apart by neglect, untreated illnesses, and a system that let people like Austin fall through the cracks? A week after Jessica's arrest, the small town of Fairview was still reeling. The media had latched onto the story, labeling Jessica as the demon mother in sensational headlines, painting a portrait of a woman consumed by religious fanaticism. But Cook knew the truth was far more tragic than the lurid stories being peddled by reporters. He and Monroe had sat through multiple meetings with psychologists and lawyers, preparing for the inevitable trial. Jessica's defense would hinge on her long history of mental illness. The prosecution had a solid case, but they knew the trial would be a formality. Jessica Harris wasn't an evil mastermind. She was a deeply sick woman who had been abandoned by every safeguard that should have protected both her and Austin. On a particularly gray afternoon, Cook found himself standing at Austin's gravesite. A modest stone had been placed there by a few of his classmates, marking the resting place of a boy whose life had been tragically cut short. He had no family left to mourn him, no relatives who had stepped forward. His father hadn't even come back for the funeral. As Cook stood there, he couldn't help but feel the bitter sting of failure. Austin had been failed by so many, and now it was too late to make it right. He didn't stand a chance, a voice said softly from behind him. Cook turned to see Monroe standing there, her face somber. No, he didn't, Cook replied, shaking his head. It's easy to blame Jessica, and in some ways she deserves that. But it wasn't just her. It was everything around her. A broken system. A town that looked the other way. Monroe nodded, her eyes fixed on the gravestone. We'll never be able to fix everything, Jim, but maybe we can stop this from happening again. Raise the alarm when we see people like Jessica slipping through the cracks. Cook gave a weary sigh. Maybe Oregon, maybe this is just another tragedy that people will forget about by next year. As the wind picked up, blowing leaves across the cemetery, the two detectives stood in silence, paying their respects to a boy whose potential had been extinguished far too soon. 3 months later, the courthouse in Fairview was packed with reporters, townspeople, and curious onlookers as Jessica Harris's trial began. The small town had never seen a case of this magnitude, and the atmosphere inside the courtroom was charged with a strange mix of horror and fascination. People wanted to know how a mother could kill her own son, how such a tragedy could have happened in their quiet community. Detective Cook sat at the back of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with a heavy heart. The prosecution laid out the facts of the case in painstaking detail: Austin's death, the evidence of restraint, and the overwhelming proof that Jessica had planned the murder in her delusional state. Yet, it was hard to ignore the sympathy Jessica's defense team was cultivating. They painted her as a victim of a broken system, a woman who had begged for help but had been left to spiral into madness. It was a narrative that wasn't far from the truth. Jessica sat quietly at the defense table, her once vacant expression now replaced by a subdued but clear sadness. She seemed to understand, at least on some level, that what had happened to Austin was wrong, but the details of her actions, her belief that she had been fighting demons, still lingered beneath her calm demeanor. The prosecution's case was strong, focusing on the premeditation of the crime. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified to Jessica's long-standing mental health issues, but they emphasized that she had made a choice to stop treatment, that she had ignored years of medical advice. They argued that her decision to tie up Austin and methodically kill him showed a level of intent that couldn't be excused by her illness alone. Still, the defense countered with their own experts. They detailed the torment Jessica had suffered for years, living in a world where reality and delusion blurred together. They described how her untreated schizophrenia had convinced her that her son was possessed, and that her actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of a mother desperately trying to save her child from something she believed to be real. The town was divided. Some believed Jessica was evil, while others saw her as a tragic figure who had been let down by the very system meant to protect her. As the trial continued, the tension in the air grew, everyone waiting to see what the jury would decide. The trial lasted for weeks, and by the time the jury was sent to deliberate, the courtroom had become a second home for Cook and Monroe. They attended every session, watching the tragedy play out over and over again. The testimonies, the gruesome photos, the psychiatric evaluations, it all weighed heavily on them both. On the final day, the jury returned with their verdict. The room was silent as the foreman stood reading from the slip of paper. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jessica Harris, not guilty by reason of insanity. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Jessica didn't react, her eyes downcast, as if she had already resigned herself to this fate. The judge immediately ordered her to be remanded to a psychiatric facility where she would be evaluated and treated, possibly for the rest of her life. For Cook, the verdict was a bitter relief. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. Austin was still gone, and Jessica, for all her delusions, was still his mother, a mother who had loved him in her own twisted, tragic way. The system had failed them both, and now one was dead, and the other would live out her days in a psychiatric institution. As Cook and Monroe left the courthouse, a few reporters tried to stop them for comments, but they waved them off. There was nothing more to say. She'll be locked up for life, Monroe said as they walked down the courthouse steps, in a hospital but still locked away. Cook nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. I wonder if she'll ever understand what she did. I mean, really understand it. Monroe shrugged, pulling her jacket tighter against the chilly wind. I don't know, Jim, I'm not sure if she ever will. Maybe in her mind she'll always believe she saved Austin. Maybe that's her punishment, living with the belief that she was right even when we know she was so horribly wrong. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the courthouse doors swing open and shut as people filed out, their conversations hushed. "I just keep thinking about Austin," Cook said after a long pause. "That kid had his whole life ahead of him, and he was the one who had to carry the weight of his mother's illness. He should have been protected. He should have had someone looking out for him." Monroe nodded, her expression somber. He was just a kid trying to survive, and no one noticed until it was too late. They walked back to the car in silence, the weight of the case lingering with them. There would be no closure, no neat resolution. Jessica Harris would be forgotten by the town soon enough, relegated to a footnote in Fairview's history. But for Cook, the case would stay with him, a haunting reminder of how easily people could slip through the cracks, how quickly a tragedy could unfold when no one was paying attention. As they drove away, Cook stared out the window at the quiet streets of Fairview, wondering how many other families were out there, struggling in silence, waiting for someone to notice before it was too late. Weeks had passed since the verdict, but Detective Jim Cook found himself unable to move on from the Harris case. He replayed the details in his mind: the broken family, the neglected signs, and Austin's quiet suffering. No matter how hard he tried to shake it, the image of that boy's lifeless body haunted his thoughts. On a dreary afternoon, Cook sat in his office staring blankly at his paperwork. A stack of new cases lay untouched on his desk, but his mind was still entangled with Austin's story. Across from him, Detective Monroe shuffled through her own files, glancing at him from time to time. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Cook looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I just can't get past the fact that it didn't have to end this way. There were so many opportunities, so many people who could have stepped in, and no one did. Now we've got a dead kid and a mother who'll spend the rest of her life in a psych ward, all because the system failed." Monroe sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know, we've both seen it before, but this one hits different. I keep thinking about how he was planning to go to college to get out of Fairview. He had a chance at a better life." Cook nodded, his mind drifting back to the day they'd found out about Austin's college acceptance. He was probably counting down the days until he could leave. It's heartbreaking knowing he was so close. Monroe tapped her pen on the desk, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "What if we did something about it?" Cook raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "The system. The way it failed Austin. We can't bring him back, but maybe we could make sure something like this doesn't happen again." She leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "We've got the connections, Jim. We know the warning signs better than anyone. What if we worked with the local schools, social services, even the hospital, to set up some kind of early intervention program, something to help catch these families before they hit rock bottom?" Cook stared at her, considering her words. The idea wasn't far-fetched, and it could make a real difference. He thought about the missed opportunities in Jessica's life, how no one had noticed when she stopped going to therapy, how Austin had been allowed to shoulder the burden of caring for her alone. If there had been a system in place to catch those red flags earlier, maybe things would have turned out differently. "An early intervention program," he repeated, rolling the idea around in his mind. "You really think we could get something like that off the ground?" Monroe shrugged. "Why not? We know the players. We've worked with schools, hospitals, and social services on cases before. If we can get a few key people on board, we could build something. Maybe it won't be perfect, but it's better than just waiting for the next tragedy." Cook sat back in his chair, a glimmer of hope stirring inside him for the first time in weeks. It wasn't going to bring Austin back, but it might give other kids like him a fighting chance. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's do it." Over the next few months, Cook and Monroe poured their energy into their new mission. They reached out to school administrators, local hospitals, and social workers, pitching their idea for an early intervention program designed to catch families struggling with mental health issues before they spiraled out of control. To their surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. They worked late nights drafting plans, pulling data from past cases, and crafting presentations to secure funding. The more they talked to people, the clearer it became that Fairview and towns like it needed this program. Teachers shared stories of students who had slipped through the cracks, social workers described overwhelmed families with no support, and doctors recounted patients like Jessica Harris who had stopped seeking treatment because they felt forgotten. One of their biggest breakthroughs came from the school counselor who had known Austin. She had always felt uneasy about the situation but hadn't known what steps to take beyond the occasional check-in. "If we had a way to flag these kids," she said during a meeting, "if there was a process in place to follow up, Austin might still be alive." Hearing that only solidified Cook's resolve. He wasn't just doing this for Austin anymore, he was doing it for every kid who had been failed by the cracks in the system. By the end of the year, the Fairview Early Intervention Program FEEP was launched. It was small at first, just a pilot program, but it had the backing of the local school district, hospital, and social services. The program set up a network of communication between these institutions, creating a system where teachers, doctors, and counselors could flag at-risk students and families for follow-up care. The goal was to intervene before things escalated, to offer support before it was too late. Cook and Monroe weren't just detectives anymore, they had become advocates, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And while the scars of the Harris case would never fully heal, this new mission gave them a sense of purpose that neither of them had felt in a long time. As the months passed, the program began to show results. Families were connected with resources, children were given the help they needed, and slowly but surely, the cracks in the system were being filled.